All right, chapter 6, entitled Intimately Oppressed. The chapter discusses women basically from the early settlements up until pre-Civil War during the Industrial Revolution. The chapter starts out by contrasting women in European society and, also in American colonial society versus women in the tribal and Native American society. In the tribal society, women were regarded on a higher level and granted more respect, not only because of their role in the family and as child bearers, but the entire societal structure was placed the woman more as a central figure in that whole construct. Whereas in the American and European societies, the monogamous family was more a practical unit for work and socialization. So while the woman, in fact, did hold some power within the home and in the family individually, societally she was more or less invisible in the legal system, and really when it came to anything that had to do with politics, opinion, land rights, etc. There was sort of a duality and a layering of the subjugation that's interesting in as separated by gender rather than by race. In the racial segregation, it was more of the iron fist approach, where the slave classes and even Indians that weren't necessarily slaves but people of color were subjugated more brutally. And if you were one of those people, man or woman of a different race, you were just put out as a lesser type of human, and in some cases even more subhuman classification. Whereas with the women, they were treated at times with a good bit of respect. Case in point, like a conversation on the street, you would talk to the woman politely and listen to her and grant her some respect in that conversation. However, sort of in the back of the mind, and then more broadly from a legal standpoint, she really wasn't due any of that respect from that legal standpoint. So most of this stemmed from her role within the family, and again, it sort of all goes back to the childbearing, but also, she would also, by extension, be granted the respect due to her husband, which would be associated with his position. So again, with the layering, not only were all women basically invisible legally, but then there was a tiered subjugation in a class structure among, I guess, financial lines, sort of, in terms of high class and low class, just as it was for all people, for all whites during that time. In the early, it went on to talk about the early colonial days and how women really in the early settlements had it better off in some ways than they had further down the road. Because at first, for a couple reasons, one was there was very few women. The original ships that came over were primarily consisted of men as the settlers. So the women, they were more prized because they were scarce. So they were treated better, at least the free women. Of course, the slave and servant classes had it very bad. If they were slaves of color, of course, they were treated just horrendously, as were the men. And even the servant classes of women were treated poorly, just like the men. But of course, to make it worse, women were scarce, and there was the persistent and prevalent threat of sexual abuse, which it did talk about it some in the chapter, but I don't. This is just speculation, but I imagine that it was quite rampant and commonplace. I mean, it had to be during those times. But anyway, with the free women, there were few of them, like I said, but also there was few people overall. They had to settle the colonies and build the homes and do all that work, and the tasks were by and large shared across gender lines. So in those very early days, it notes that the women were treated more as equals, just because they all shared the same load of responsibility. And then went on to say that later on, once civilization came in and you got under the legal system, the women weren't actually granted any rights under the law, so they got pushed out of public life, and that sense of equality waned significantly. There were a few examples, and it went on throughout the chapter to name quite a few as time went on, of women that were extraordinary and sort of broke out of those confines and actually did get into professional work and being speakers, were ministers, and even later on attending university and law. But of course, those were the exception, not the rule. There was quite a few examples also of women's groups getting together to advocate for their own rights as well as for the rights of everyone. Early on, there was the protest and advocacy groups against the British, that just like the men against the stamp taxes and the, different goods and services and mercantile oppressions that went on. Of course, all these advocacy groups were segregated by race also, but by gender. The women would always meet separately from the men. Later on, we'll touch on this in a bit maybe, but when they went on strike during the Industrial Revolutions, some of the meetings, and because the agendas were so similar, were desegregated. By and large, the blacks were still kept out, but men and women would meet together because they were both sort of striking the same bosses, again, for better wages, etc. But usually the physical strikes would be held separately. It was interesting too. It notes that in the historical writings, the roles of the women often go ignored, which I think is very true. That's the history. It's his story of there's whoever is in charge writes the history to make themselves look better. I think that's pretty widely acknowledged. But also that the roles of the women were often molded. One example that it gave was that during the later days of the Revolution, when it was kind of losing steam and there was a lot of desertion and bad conditions, the women would come out of the towns and go to the soldiers' encampments to lend aid and bring supplies. And in some cases, they even brought up arms to aid in the fighting. However, in history, most of these women were characterized as prostitutes. But again, back to the thing with the layering, the higher class women, like Martha Washington as one example, was honored for serving that role of coming out to meet George, while lower class women basically were doing exactly the same thing, were, as I said, classed as prostitutes. After the Revolution and on into the industrial era, the women's movement was not really unified, and there was a lot of factors into this. Obviously, the ability to gain rights and freedoms under the law, to own land, to have marriage and divorce rights, there's voting, etc., were common interests, but there was a lot of different things going on, both inside the movement and outside the movement, that made it hard to have a unified front. But throughout, in the home and family, the women did have a fairly powerful role, because they ran the households in most cases, and in doing that, I mean, obviously they brought up the children, but they were also responsible for the education, which wasn't just the academic education, but it was also the religious education, the social education, and so really ran the gamut of, when you control the upbringing, and you can responsible for the children, they do have a lot of say in those type of outcomes. However, again, legally, they really had no standing. The women also, in many cases, would work from home within the community, not just for themselves. And of course, these types of jobs involved midwifing, spinning, and then they would make candles or clothing, blankets, etc., other sundries. So it was one of those things where, unlike slavery, where every slave was more or less completely desirous to be free, some women fought more aggressively than others for those rights outside of the home. Some were more content in the lifestyle they had. Some wanted to get out and work and be able to earn their own living. Others just wanted to have legal rights. And like I said, some were more content in that station. So it wasn't exactly a unified front. Of course, as the industrial era got rolling, the propaganda was really unfurled, both in the law and in education and religion, to keep the female subdued and tied to the family life. Again, rather than the iron fist approach, it was more of a velvet glove, which in this case involved a psychological approach. They would use clever language and snob appeal to bring, they would assign dignity with types of behavior and styles of dress and political action. So it would seem unbecoming to get involved in a lot of these type of movements, and that it wasn't just you were beaten into submission, but that you were looked upon as, it was unattractive to be involved, which of course was very effective. Along in the industrial era, once the women did begin coming out and working, of course their wages were half, or in a lot of cases less than half, of what a man would earn for the same work. Women were, by and large, excluded from professional work. Again, towards the middle part of the 1800s, a very few did start gaining acceptance into university, and they could get into the professions such as law or medicine or ministry, etc. But mostly when the women got out to work, it was in the mills, spinning mills primarily, because they would segregate by gender again, the working. So women would work in groups, like I said, mostly in the spinning mills. As 1800s, in the late 1820s and 30s and on, there was a number of factory strikes involving women's groups and walkouts. The labor strife, again, as I mentioned before, was mostly segregated. They would occasionally join together because they really acknowledged that there was a common enemy, sort of, in the mill owners and the moneyed elite groups. There was also many examples right on into Sojourner Truth, who was a black woman, former slave, but women were very outspoken in the anti-slavery movement, and there was lots of examples going on about the different paths of advocacy and different individual women who did things to advocate for not only women's rights but slave rights and a variety of different agendas they were going after. That was basically the gist of the chapter. Women, by and large, were ignored throughout. It really, right past the times brought out in this chapter and on through up till really fairly recently, legally and politically. So I'm sure the book will go into these, revisit women in more recent times as the book goes on.